If I said the words biggest arm wrestler in history, there are several massive arm wrestlers that may come to mind. Perhaps many people would think of prime Richard Lubkes. Richard certainly was a giant at well over 6 feet tall and over 300 pounds. Richard just looked terrifying. Others might think of prime Denis Saplinkov. Although Denis was not the heaviest arm wrestler, he was also extremely lean. In terms of measuring only contractile tissue, Denis is one of the biggest guys in the sport. And of course, Levon Saginashvili cannot go without being mentioned. He is the current #1 rank in the world, and he has competed at well over 400 pounds. And honestly, he is pretty lean for a 400 pounder that doesn't really care about training legs. Just looking at Levon versus Devin Larratt, you can see how massive he really is. Devin makes most people look tiny, but compared to Levon, he looks like a child. Levon is definitely a giant. However, Levon is not the biggest arm wrestler in the history of the sport. In fact, he's not even close to the biggest. Cleve Dean is listed at 6'7" and his weight is listed as high as 600 pounds. At this size, Cleve would make Levon look like a pretty regular dude. Now, to be fair, there are other sources that list Cleve's weight at around 450 to 465 pounds, but according to John Brzenk, he reached 500 to 600 pounds.
He was 500, 600 pounds at some points in his life.
Some say that Cleve did reach around 600 pounds, but not until later in his life after he stopped competing. Regardless, Cleve was still a massive individual, and this greatly advantaged him on the table. His hand size and wrist thickness made it nearly impossible to contain his top roll. Cleve's top roll is not the normative technique of today's arm wrestling scene, but it was very effective in his time. Cleve's go-to technique was a form of the exploding hand technique. Cleve would maintain his shoulder commitment, pronation, and cup all at the same time. This resulted in a combination of a press and a top roll, leaving his opponents with no options. Cleve's hand and wrist structure is part of what allowed him to do this. He generally wasn't too worried about getting turned into a hook. Trying to hook Cleve Dean would be like trying to lift a Millennium dumbbell with normal size hands. The handle is so fat that you just can't even access your power. It feels completely impossible. And for most people going up against Cleve, it was. Cleve ended up claiming the #1 rank in the world 3 times in his career. Once in 1978, again in 1983, and finally in 1994. One of Cleve's most famous matches is against John Brzenk in 1993. During this poll we see here, John didn't even attempt to fight Cleve in a traditional lane. John concluded that it was actually easier to beat Cleve using a dad move rather than trying to fight with his hand. So John took a super low grip and did everything he could do to isolate Cleve's arm, and this proved to be effective. And this was probably Cleve's biggest apparent weakness. There was a significant imbalance between his hand and his arm power, although this imbalance may have been unavoidable considering how long his arms are. Now, the question that a lot of people have asked about Cleve is, was he a natural athlete? And the general consensus seems to be that he was in fact natural. If this is true, you can only imagine how ridiculous Cleve would have been if he had used the same recipes that some of the athletes of today use. Now, as many of you know, Cleve ended up passing away in May of 2011, at which point he had been retired from the sport for a few years. But many have said that Cleve may have been the most genetically elite athlete the sport has ever seen. If Cleve was in fact a natural athlete when he competed, did he have the potential to reach the level of someone like Levon in theory? John Brzenk thinks that this may have been possible.
If anybody had the ability to take it to the next level or next 3 or 4 levels to compete against someone like Levon, it would have been Cleve Dean.
So let me know what you guys think about this. Do you think Cleve had as much raw potential as someone like Levon did? It's also worth noting that Cleve allegedly did not even train using traditional arm wrestling exercises and weights, but built all of his strength from working on a farm. You have to wonder what kind of level Cleve could have reached if he was incorporating proper training, diet, and pancake usage. Regardless of what could have been, Cleve is still one of the absolute legends of the sport. Even without pancakes or traditional training, he managed to reach the #1 spot in the world on 3 separate occasions. I can only imagine what it would have felt like to try to take a grip with Cleve. He certainly was one of a kind. And who knows, maybe he really did have more natural arm wrestling power than anyone else in history.